talk. It's like a rowdy group of school children. I'm so excited to have Fabrizio and an amazing lineup of speakers here tonight. I've almost got your attention. It's not happening. I know. Well, I think that's actually a very good sign, so I'm glad that you all enjoyed that. So if you aren't familiar with the Conduit, talks like this happen on a regular basis here, and we're really keen to expand our network of change makers. So if you enjoy tonight and you're keen to find out more, please don't hesitate to come and find some of the team. We've got the lovely Perez and Ali at the back of the room who lead on our partnerships and our live events. We will be at COP and various other pop-ups in the next few months. So please do get engaged. But without further ado, I'm super excited to hand over to Fabrizio. Thank you so much, Fabrizio, and enjoy the evening, everyone.
Thank you. I think it was not fair. I mean, talking about purpose for 30 seconds or 45 seconds. I mean, some people write books about purpose, so well done, huh? So I'm Fabrizio. For those who don't know me, I tutor on the Sustainable Finance course, and in my, when I don't do that, I specialize in green finance for corporates and as well from investors. I do write, not books, not yet, articles about it. My blog is available. It's called Capital Matters if you're interested. In any case, that's about me. But today, the title is How Finance as a Community Can Support Business Transformation. And community is really the key word. And we got inspiration through... Who has done the online course, Sustainable Finance course? Okay, well, let's say 30% of the audience. There is one part of the course, and I don't know if Alex is here. Alex? Simon? No. Are you there? Or are you hiding? Okay, the headmasters or the head tutors. There's one part of the course which, from a tutoring perspective, is a lot of work, but it's so rewarding. And this is about the chats. Those who participated, you remember the chats where a group of 80, 90 students talk about the carrot and stick approach. How do you bring more money into sustainable finance? And what is amazing about this is that it's really a community. So we have people from the US, Asia, Europe, so regional background, which is different, but as well from a professional background, consultants, banks, policymakers, really talking and chatting. And again, it's really, really rich, but that gave us inspiration for the event of today. So I think the community at CISL is really, really strong. And that's what we want to talk about today. How as a community, we're going to actually finance that transformation. That business transformation, which is the topic of today, and we're going to have Ben coming. We're so lucky to have Ben. So what's the program? Very quickly. So this is the fourth, actually it's not the third, it's the fourth, I can't count, sorry, event, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So thank you for coming. It's really nice to see people, see friends, and the spirit of community is very strong. And that's been possible through a group of volunteers. Alice Chappell, she's not here today, unfortunately. Andrew is here. Gori, is Gori here somewhere? People are hiding, I think. Rajni, she's not. Sophia, I've seen Sophia. Sophia, where are you? Ah, she's there. Sophia has been very instrumental. Dagmara, where are you, Dagmara? She's over there. And Claudia. Claudia's here as well. She's there. So if you want to participate to make the next event even more successful, please, we need energy, we need your help. So don't hesitate to come to us and talk. It's about the people and the community. So how are we going to do this? I have a picture for you. How are we going to do this together? So how can we abate? But that's about climate, of course. It's about social equality, it's about human rights, it's about the environment. There's so many topics, especially in this current context. How are we going to do this together? And as we say, and I will stop very quickly, it's about, today we're going to talk about business transformation. So Ben Kellard, really lucky to have you. Lots of experience, 25 years of experience in business transformation, business strategy, researcher at Cambridge on the topic, and as well a practitioner through advisory. And Ben, you released the framework 2 weeks ago, and so really great to have you. So Ben will do a keynote speech for 15 minutes, and then we go into panel discussion. So that's the first part. Second part will be the panel discussion. We have Valeria, more than 20 years again, coming from different backgrounds, PRI, asset management, and working now at Phoenix, doing really a lot of work in stewardship. Caroline, again, another person, super experienced. I think it's about 30 years there in capital markets. One anecdote about Caroline, she rejected, if I can say, it's probably not the right word, but she decided not to go to another event, which is really important, which means that this event is even more important. Thank you, Caroline. And then so we have the panel, and then it's about mingling and making the community work together. So that's as well the main purpose of today. But without further ado, Ben, can you kick us off?
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here this evening, and thanks for all coming. It's lovely to see so many of our alumni here. So what I want to do is just share really kind of thoughts in 3 main buckets, really. So first of all, thinking about what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the why that we're looking at here? Secondly, I want to share some of the thinking that we've been doing, and as Fabrizio mentioned, we launched just last week the Business Transformation Framework. So what is it, and what might it mean for you and your clients? And then finally, as part of a sort of conversation starter, what might that mean for financial institutions? What might be the role of financial institutions just as a sort of a kickstart? So there's sort of 3 buckets I thought we might look at. As you're probably aware, we know more about the state of the planet's health than ever before. And it's not pretty reading. In the build-up to COP15, the other COP, the Nature COP last year, there's a lot of research we're seeing from the UN, WWF, and so on, telling us about the state of nature. It's an unprecedented level of understanding we have. And it's showing us that around about 1 million species are at risk. It's showing that since 1970, that 69% of species have been in sharp decline. And that's across all species in all regions. So our nature is in free fall. And we're well aware, of course, of the climate challenges we're facing as well. And as one of our esteemed economists, Professor Dasgupta, wrote in his report for the British government, he pointed out, we're looking at the economics of nature. He said we've made a fundamental systemic error. And that's we've treated economy as something over here and the ecology as something over here, whereas in course they're absolutely interlinked. In fact, as one of our faculty say, the economy is a fully owned subsidiary of nature. Without a healthy planet, of course, we don't have a healthy society, we don't have a healthy economy. And yet we've overlooked that systemically at almost every level. And so part of the underlying issue that we're facing is that, of course, for largely my lifetime, we've focused almost exclusively on financial value creation. That is what our capital markets and our financial systems have been focusing on, which ladder up to GDP. The idea being that that is a proxy for well-being. That's what we've used. Even though the inventors of GDP said if there's one thing you shouldn't do is use GDP as a proxy for well-being. And what is it we do? We use GDP as a proxy for well-being. So, but the risk of that is that we're only looking at the world through, it's a bit like looking at the world in black and white. It's true, it tells us a very accurate picture. Finance is very important, it tells us truth about the world around us. But like black and white, it doesn't tell us the full story. We need to see things in colour, we need to see the full range, and that means we need to understand the stocks and flows of natural and social capital as well, on which that financial capital is dependent. But unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of that, as you know, we are starting to learn that journey, but we're still at the very early stages of really what does that mean to inform our understanding of financial capital. And so I think what we need to move towards is really have that more understanding of true value creation, and what are the true costs associated with that. That's the direction we need to move in order to understand the relationship between the economy and ecology, and so that we can see that both there's a health. So we move from a state of what's balanced. So rather than, because the risk of Maximizing anything, when you maximize something, is that everything else becomes a means to that end. And that includes society, and that includes the planet, and of course that's exactly what we've done for the last 50 years or so. So there's some of the underlying challenges. And so I think one of the, and as David Attenborough said, therefore, we have to challenge some of those assumptions, which is that if the assumption that we've had behind the model so far is that nature and climate is stable, abundant, and infinite. That's the assumption we have behind the current economic model. But as David Attenborough said, if you think that growth is infinite, you're either a madman or you're an economist. Leave you to decide which one, So I think what we need to understand then is that important interrelationship between that. So it's a challenge, if you like, that lies right at the heart of our society, as well as our markets, as well as, of course, our financial institutions, all of which are playing a hand in that. And so we need to be reorientating, or as we say at CISL, we need to rewire what the economy looks like. And there's roles for business, there's roles for finance, and there's roles for governance in rewiring the economy. And so what I wanted to kind of share then, so what might that mean for the role of businesses? Because, of course, as financial institutions, you both are businesses, and you would obviously fund, invest, and manage businesses in your portfolios. Well, first of all, one of the things we've seen is a great breakthrough, which is that we've known, I think, for a long time that business as usual isn't viable anymore. The idea that you can just profit maximize and assume that nature and society is infinite and stable is not valid anymore. As we say, business as usual is dead. And we have sense of what we're moving towards, but there's not really consensus yet on what does good look like. What is that alternative? Well, last year, there was a consortium that came together to build out a principle-based standard for what a sustainable purpose-led business looks like. And it's free to download through BSI, the British Standards Institute, and it's called PAS 808. So it's our first real attempt to set out the behaviours, worldviews, and principles behind a sustainable purpose-led business. We also have a sense of what the outcomes of a sustainable purpose-led business would lead to. It'd be net zero, it'd be circular, it'd be restorative of nature, and socially inclusive. But the real challenge is how do we take businesses from the current paradigm and shift into that future of where businesses need to go if they're to be relevant and resilient in the future. So one of the things we did is we published last week is what we're calling a business transformation framework, which sets out how businesses can understand where they currently are performing and where getting to the future might look like. And so it outlines 12 different areas of a business, which looks at both how a business is operated, both internally, but also how it engages externally. And of course, that's critical because we know businesses can't be sustainable in an unsustainable system. So they have to get out there and shape those enabling conditions, whether that's infrastructure, regulation, capital markets, in order to enable those business models of the future. And so it looks at things like, what is the fundamental purpose and value of the organization? Is it profit maximizing, or is it understanding what its core contribution to society is through its core competence, for example? And we set out across those 12 different areas 4 different stages of development, ranging from, if you like, short-term self-interest, which is still around profit maximization, but taking a peripheral view of sustainability, where it's really about pacifying active stakeholders to neutralize pressure, and that's the kind of the first stage. Then we move into this sort of more long-term self-interest, which is still around profit maximizing, but into the medium to long term. So it's about investing in sustainability where there's a proven case for still maximizing medium to long-term profits. And that's sort of an early and late, if you like, early and mature phase of that stage, or if you like, enlightened shareholder value is another term I'm sure you're familiar with. So they're the kind of stages 1, 2, and 3. And then we have this sort of final area, which is underpinned by the PAS, the British Standard, which is around being a fully purpose-driven organization, which is about understanding the fundamental purpose is about how its core competence is really serving society's changing needs and protecting those dependencies on nature and society, and that really cuts right the way through the rest of how the organization operates. So it sets out across these 12 areas what those four stages would look like. It looks at how the role of senior leadership. It looks at operational management. It looks at how they engage with their investors. It looks at how they engage with stakeholders through partnerships, collaborations, so on, and setting that out. So it's something that can be used, as I say, for businesses to both say, okay, well, where do we think? What's the evidence in our business that tells us, and which of those 4 categories best describes where we are? So you can almost create like a spider diagram for your current performance. And then it can help you say, well, where do we want to be? Do we want to be fully purpose-driven, or do we want to be do we want to be just still profit maximizing in the medium term? But what are risks associated with that? What assumptions are we making around how relevant we'll be? Whether we're meeting society's needs with our current products and services? Are we over-reliant on dependencies on nature that actually might not be viable? So it helps you understand, balance out where do we want to get to, and then start to think about what levers we might pull in order to get there. So that's a bit about thinking about business transformation, what it might mean for your companies and the companies you're interacting with. So finally, I want to just land on maybe a few little provocations. So what might this mean for the wider finance community? As all different aspects of finance, of course, absolutely critical part of the economy. Well, one of the things that we talk about in our Rewiring the Economy is we talk about three tasks for the finance sector, which I think underpin this. So the first is ensuring that capital is working for the long term. And as Mark Carney points out, that's really helping financial services do what it does at its best, which is pulling forward risk into the present day and making sure that's reflected in capital. Making also sure that the price of capital is according to the full activities of the business. So if they're drawing down and creating risks on their dependencies on nature and society, those risks are actually incorporated into capital allocation and costs. And finally, innovating financial structures to serve sustainable business models into the future. So that's what we talk about in Rewiring the Economy. So I think the first thing, of course, is actually transforming the business itself, and that's something maybe we can explore on the panel, which I know we've got a lot of experience there. So what does that mean for a bank, the bank you're in? What does that mean? Crucially, of course, it means also how are you helping transforming your clients, for those of you that have relationship management with clients, either in your asset portfolios and so on. And we've just also launched a piece of work called Let's Discuss Nature with Climate. And I think Sarah might be in the room today, one of the contributors. Sarah, are you here? Could you raise a hand if you're here? I can't see her, but anyway, otherwise. So we've just launched that again. It's free on our website, and it talks about a process that relationship managers can use and tools there to help them in actively managing them and in an appropriate way. Another area, I think, is SMEs. We know how critical they are to the economy, but let's be honest, they're often overlooked in terms of services from financial services. So how is it that banks can play a role in helping them to adapt and innovate toward a low-carbon, nature-positive future? Well, often, of course, the cash flow is very tight, they're very busy, lack expertise. So what's the role of financial services? What are the opportunities to support SMEs? And that's something we'll be looking at as CISL. Another critical area is aligning both the values and the incentives across the investment chain. So often, as we know, of course, the actual link between myself, say, as a pension holder, investing in, and right the way through to the managers and the actual assets and so on, right across the value chain, investment chain, can often be misaligned. So how do we create greater alignment and incentives that are really serving the values of both me as the ultimate, if you like, customer, and the outcome? So actually, for example, in a pension fund, that's actually being invested in companies that are going to create a future I want to retire into. Another key area is how to scale, the role of financial services scaling up solutions. Often we know a lot of the technologies that are out there. There's research that around about 60 to 70% of the technologies we need to create a net zero future are here today, but we need to scale them up. But often some of the barriers to those scalings is not the right financial products available in order to scale them up. Take regenerative agriculture. If you're a farmer, a lot of the know-how is there. We know a lot of the practices, but as farmers, they don't know how to often access capital. The products and services aren't there. That's an opportunity for financial service institutions. That's just regenerative agriculture. What are some of the other opportunities there? And the key systems, particularly, we need to transform, like energy, food, and transport. And then the final two is, of course, the role of boards. Boards are critical, and you have critical influence as financial services institutions over ensuring that boards are well-equipped and representing the value networks in which they operate. And there's research which shows that often that's not the case, that actually board members are not reflecting those impacts and dependencies they're having across their value chain. And a colleague of mine, Gillian Secret, is here this evening. We've just published some research looking at the role of boards through a big piece of work we're doing with DLA Piper. That's, again, free on our website to check out if you want to look at some of the leading research around the composition and capabilities of board members. And finally, it's about positive advocacy. It's about leaning into the very fast-changing regulatory landscape. We know, obviously, in a post-Brexit, when there's a regulation coming through from the European Union, as well as in other regions. We've got elections in pretty much every region next year. As we know, it's very fast-moving. So what's the role of financial institutions to really lean into that? And one of the things we're really passionate about at CISL is how do we align the role of different actors in different sectors to create a sustainable future? It's no good if businesses are going it alone or regulation is being created which doesn't work for businesses or isn't aligned with financial incentives. So rather than be bystanders sitting on the sidelines or leaving it to somebody else, what can financial services and financial institutions do to really lean into that and use your shared voice? And of course, through our leadership groups, we're trying to play a role in helping to catalyse and provide those forums. There's a real both opportunity for yourselves to help that create those unlock. So there are some provocations. Thank you for lending me your ears. Fabrizio, over to you. I look forward to opening up the conversation. Thank you.
Then can I invite the panelists to come in? Lots, I mean, it was just 15 minutes, but you opened a lot of topics. I think, of course, first of all, so this is the final slide. We have people online as well. Is the online working? Oh, great. So just hello to everyone online. Thank you for joining us. Of course, the topic today is how you assist corporates in the transformation. But perhaps, actually, you planted the seeds, and why don't we talk about our own transformation first? And but as well, obviously, if you can introduce yourself better than me, and start talking about how you think about your own transformation as a business. Valeria.
Sorry, it was simple actually. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. Great. So my name is Valeria Piani, and I'm heading the stewardship team within Phoenix Group. I'm not sure you know Phoenix Group as a brand. We're relatively new, but we do manage a lot of pension schemes for a lot of UK citizens. Maybe if I say Standard Life, you would recognize more likely the name. We do have other brands like Reassure or Phoenix Life itself, but we do serve around 12 million of customers in the UK and a little bit in Ireland and in Germany. So when you were talking about where is our money going, a lot of it is with us. We do have a stewardship function that has the primarily goal of overseeing what our asset managers do. We're actually totally outsourced, so all our investment decision-making are done by our asset managers that we appoint and we have a mandate with. But we also take responsibility internally as much as we can, as we feel that we cannot really challenge and oversee what they do if we don't know what we're talking about. So we do select some themes that we care a lot, and we do thematic engagement on these themes, and we conduct engagement with investee companies on these themes directly. So then we can also ask the same question to the manager and see if there's alignment or not. But the value chain is quite complicated. It starts from the beneficiaries who are telling us they care about climate, they care about nature, they care about human rights, and they care about equal rights. These are the ones that are mostly named in surveys that we do on an annual basis. Then it's us. We're responsible towards these customers, and we need to appoint the managers. I think we have a responsibility to take some of the advocacy role that you said, but also sector-wide type of conversation. It's not just the one-to-one conversation with the companies. It's actually how we talk about the challenges of specific sectors, not just on climate change. Then there's the managers. They have a huge responsibility because they need to select the companies going in different portfolios. They need to produce products that they're actually sustainable, and now there's a lot of regulation around it. And they need to report back to us on what they're doing. And the data we receive is not always the same. Sometimes it's pears and apples that you compare. So a lot of work is about making sure we actually can compare them. And a lot of the challenges are around outcomes. So they engage with the companies a lot, but what are the outcomes of this conversation? Can they actually tell us about what they're achieving with this discussion? And then there are service providers, the ones that actually provided the data to us. We cannot just engage with the companies individually. We need to see portfolios across all the different asset classes. We are universal owners. We own pretty much every single slice of the economy, talking about the fact that the economy is not disconnected with big themes and big systemic issues. So we need the data. We need to see how our portfolios are performing against scenarios. But it's not just climate, it's human rights, it's social issues, which actually are very difficult to quantify. So we make commitments, but to be able to implement these commitments, we need the data. And not always the methodologies behind this data is transparent for us to understand. And then there's another and final role, which is investor networks, which are very active and we are very much participating in. Which do have their own role to make sure that we engage collectively and not just individually. And I think we all have a duty almost to participate collectively in these efforts rather than have separate conversation with the companies all the time. But I to answer your question, transformation of Phoenix itself, a lot of work is going on the different topics that I mentioned that our clients care a lot about. I think where we probably have advanced more is climate, and as we issue our first net zero plan. I think there's more work to do for us on social and human rights. We have a human rights policy now. It took us 1 year to set it up, but now, again, is next. How do we implement it? And nature is the big question mark, because we are trying to pilot in TNFD. We are collecting the data, but it's very patchy. There are many gaps.
Thank you.
I'll stop here.
No, that's great. So I'll come back on the value chain and how we can align this value chain. But Caroline.
I've now learned what we need to do to start this. So hello, my name is Caroline Haas. I head up the Climate and ESG Capital Markets business at NatWest. I've been at NatWest for about almost 5 years. And what is interesting is I had the pleasure of, when we first started on this journey, to be in what we called the tribes in 2019, where climate became one of the 3 really important pillars within NatWest, alongside learning and enterprise. And I think that sort of almost shows you a little bit the direction of travel and the sort of thought process behind how we have started that transformation process. Very much to Valeria's point, climate is fundamental. It is hugely important as we all think about this, but it is also challenging. And I think as we get deeper into the weeds and start to look at how we're actually changing our systems, it becomes ever more imperative of what we're actually doing. And I think sometimes that's underestimated as financial institutions, what is actually being done in-house. I think, what I found fascinating is our balance sheet is about 50% mortgages. We bank 25% of the SMEs in the UK. And this is where you start to understand, when we start modeling it and the type of modeling risk that's associated with this, how we want to actually do the transition plans that are associated with decarbonizing actually our balance sheet. To the point about working as an industry and industry groups, our head of climate was very involved with the transition plans task force that was launched in the UK, and we were talking about it earlier. When you start to look at the different definitions around climate, the easier one is almost to start at the green side and actually define what is green. And then it starts to get much more gray as we start to think about transition. So where the UK has definitely pushed out is actually looking at transition. And we have been, lockstep with that. We have announced our transition plan. We have actually, had our sectoral targets verified by a third party. Now, we say this so easily. We say, we've got Science-Based Target Initiative, verified targets. We are one of very few European banks that have been able to do that. And we say that sort of at the split of the hat, this is what we've done. And I just can tell you the hours and the time that has gone in to do that, because the data, and it's interesting, we recently did a survey with about 225 asset managers. There is actually a lot of data. The problem is actually the insights out of that data and the reliability of that data. So we actually have to cut it and review it, test and learn. It's an ongoing process. So when you talk about the transformation of these organizations, it's the system change. It's the investment cases that are going in to actually make this happen. And so, I have to say I'm incredibly proud of what NatWest has done. And how we've been able to actually bring those tools, one, to the customers, which I'm sure we'll get to later, but also internally. So we're actually rolling out all of the sort of decision-making. Oh, we may be going.
Is it a test or? That was not planned.
We're all good. Continue.
Good. We are now at toes, It's like,
that was my cue to stop. So I'll be really quick. On the decision, so what we've done is we've created these dashboards. And really, to understand climate, you need to bring it to the front office. You need the front line to really appreciate what this actually means with regard to their exposures, with regard to the kind of discussions that they're having with their customers. And once you start to do that, it's amazing what you unlock, actually. And I think what's really fascinating is, even though that this is not, right now price sensitive or capital allocation, it actually starts to create behavioral change. And so the fascinating is actually seeing the conversations and listening to them, but also, my peers coming back to me and saying, what do you think about that? Should we actually do this? Should we not do that? So what's your view? And just having that thought process coming through the system is fantastic. Obviously, we do have products that help, be that green loans, green mortgages, sustainable linked loans, sustainable linked bonds. But I think actually it goes much deeper than that. And I think that's what's so exciting about the journey.
Super, thank you, Noah. And as you mentioned, in my experience, a lot of companies, financial institutions announce net zero plans without obviously knowing exactly how they can do that, because it's, and that's happening now. It's a lot of work, so I appreciate that point. But Ben, can I bring you in? So I really want to talk about the value chain, but before that, question for you. Your framework is valid for financial institutions? Yes?
Great question. Yes, we feel it's relevant for all companies. In fact, all organizations, actually, in other sectors as well. Same for financial services, because it's looking at those sort of fundamental business processes, which I think is, of course, are common to banks, they are to any other organization. And it deals with the real fundamentals. And it really starts with what the kind of fundamental purpose and strategy of the organization is. It really starts with that. So, yes, we believe it's as relevant for banks as any other company.
And what do you think is the challenge, or let's say the pain point in a consultancy world? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think that leaders face a lot of challenges, right? How all these complex trends like climate change and fourth industrial revolution and so on are playing out, particularly when you're dealing with tipping points and so on. It's overwhelming, it's complex, it's uncertain. They have to react to a whole load of crises happening at the moment. Often aren't trained to think in that way, and they haven't got the right incentives, either internally or externally. So there's a lot of headwinds. But I think really for me, where it's around the strategy process. I think it's really about, that's where the rubber hits the road. So that's when you're constrained by your business partners, the capital you've got available, the regulatory environment, and so on. And a lot of CEOs, of course, will say, actually, they don't feel like they've got a lot of freedom. We look at them as saying, oh, you're the most powerful people in society. But often CEOs will say they don't feel very powerful at all because they're hemmed in by all of these constraints. So I think it's that strategy process, actually, where a lot of strategy, or what passes for strategy in my experience, is actually financial planning. which isn't the same thing. So actually bringing in really systemic thinking about how these trends play out into the medium to long term, which questions some fundamentals about the business. What business are we in? How are we measuring value? And so on. That's what businesses need to grapple with, and then figure out the outworking of that, being realistic about the headwinds they're facing into, the opportunities they've got, adjacent opportunities, thinking creatively. But also, I think part of that is that shift to think about how do we operate as part of a network, not part of a linear chain. So I think previously in businesses, for a long time you had continuity, you were sort of a link in a chain, that chain was pretty stable in whatever business you were in, and it was like, let's not rock the boat. That was kind of the way most businesses have operated. Whereas now we're having to throw all those chains out, think of whole new nets, and not doing that on their own. That's a whole new way for business leaders to think about that they've not been trained to do. So it's a whole load of capabilities as part of that. And if businesses don't, they just simply won't be around.
Okay, we are between us, right? So this is not a corporate event, we are a community. How do we rock the boat? Do we have to rock the boat? Question.
With companies?
We're talking about, at the moment, we're talking more about the company itself, and yeah, but this is
I was reflecting on what you were saying, because we talk to companies all the time. I'm more reflecting on how we influence the investee companies we have in our portfolio, and probably on climate specifically, this conversation is not just about the single company, is the value chain of the company itself, because more and more these companies are telling us, I can't do it because nobody's demanding for it. And then we say, well, but you can't wait for the demand to react. You need to shape the demand. And then it's almost like a chicken and egg situation where now we decided, okay, maybe we need to take this value chain approach. So we talk to the oil and gas company and ask them, who are your customers and where do you think you have the biggest struggles? What is the sector that is more difficult to decarbonize? What are the solutions? And hearing these insights will help us to then talk to those customers that are still in our engagement target list anyway, because they're all hard to debate sector, and try to connect the dots rather than having these conversations in isolation. I think up to now, engagement has happened a little bit in isolation. I don't know if you're familiar with Climate Action 100+, for example, and they're now going into the second phase where they are realizing what they've achieved today is based on these one-to-one conversations. They got a lot of commitments on net zero from the companies. Emissions of these companies targeted by Climate Action 100+ actually declined, so they have got some impact. But if they really want to get to the next level, it's sector conversation and policy conversation that has to happen.
Super, so this event is timely. What's your perspectives on that value chain and how you can influence it?
So what I find fascinating is, and I do speak to financial institutions across the full ecosystem, I find it fascinating how interconnected this is and how much actually this is going to be coming as a pull factor, but differently from the consumer. So I think, I would definitely agree, I think the consumer probably needs to come along so that you have the actual demand side of that. Because the other side that's coming through is, and that's also in the SMEs, they're getting the same questions from the supply chain, from the bankers, from the private equity. So also like their whole capital base is asking these questions. And that is actually incredibly daunting. So they realize that to actually get the liquidity and the funding and the equity that they need to grow, they have got to start to shift their businesses and actually incorporate this. Now, I know ESG is always one of these acronyms right now that may not be that popular, but I always bring it back to say that actually ESG is a metrics. I know it has a lot of noise around it, but actually it's certain KPIs that are being asked, and that will span, obviously, the environmental, social, and governance. And what we repeatedly hear, though, from the asset owners, asset managers, as you start to incorporate these metrics, you actually get a better understanding of the companies. And it's actually really good for business because you get a better understanding of what is the kind of direction of travel for that entity and is it going to be sustainable in the future? Because if you actually think about where your supply chains are coming from, If you start to overlay that with climate, where's physical risk? Are you actually going to have, and I think COVID was a classic example about seeing where is that supply chain coming and has the link been broken? So there is this connectivity between the financial industry of, and I think, to be honest, that's why, in many ways, why the NGFS actually took it through the financial industry to mobilize around this, is because it is connected. And that is going to have a direct impact on the corporates indirectly and directly, but also, and it doesn't matter, honestly, if you're how big you are, to the smaller ones. But to your point earlier, the problem with the smaller ones is they just don't have the capacity. So that is where I would say, as a bank, we really see us being an enabler, helping them, supporting them, and giving them the tools to actually help them become sustainable over the long term into all of the capital flows that are happening.
I have plenty of questions. Do you
Fabrizio,
agree?
can I just build on that, if I may?
Please go ahead.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
So I think part of the characteristics I see in most sectors is one of fragmentation. So you have different people operating in different parts of the system, but they don't really know what the whole is. They can't see the effects of all of these trends on the whole system, and so they end up being fragmented and coordinated. And I think that's partly a factor of the business model we've had, the neoliberal model, which is sort of leave it to the market to decide, and so no one's really calling out what the ends are. There's some really interesting thinking coming out of by Mariana Mazzucato, from LBS, who's looking at a very different way of bringing public and private collaboration together to tackle some of these systemic challenges. And because often in that old model, the government only steps in to fix market failures. That's the thinking. Otherwise leave it to the market. Whereas this is actually taking a much more proactive role and saying, actually, we need to be clear about what are the shared ends we have. And she talks about creating missions, largely read the Sustainable Development Goals or decarbonising or something like that, with clear outcomes and goals. So you take those clear ends, and then you work back from that to say, what are the means to get there, which can really bring in different partnerships, public, private, sharing risks and rewards, having clear transparency. And she used the example of the space race with the US. You know, that drove some real innovation, public-private partnerships, you know, to put somebody on the moon. And that's a really interesting way of thinking about overcoming some of this fragmentation, I think, about saying, what are the shared goals we've got? And they're pretty clear at the moment, right? They're pretty stark. And then I think we can then be much clearer. And often that's a really critical part of the equation that seems to be missing in these sort of largely fragmented systems. Whereas you say, otherwise everyone's standing around going, who's going to take the lead? Who's going to take the lead? Shrugging their shoulders. And government's certainly not taking the lead at the moment. So I think that's a potential model we could potentially work with.
Yeah, changing as well the rules of the game, and one would argue that governments here actually have a very big role to change that rule of the game to make one activity more profitable than another activity. I mean, the carbon pricing is one. But going back to what you were saying, Caroline, in terms of the flow of capital, you said, otherwise capital is not going to come. Do you agree with my assumption that actually Valeria has a great and important role as an asset owner to really trigger that system change? Because look, I've worked in asset management, I've worked with corporates. If you're an asset manager, generally, if an asset owner, Valeria, would say, can you do this and that? If it's not unreasonable, I would do it. So do you see that as a way of change? For both, actually.
I do have... I've been the recipient, and now I'm the one pushing. I've been from an asset manager. I was doing engagement from an asset manager perspective for a few years, and now I'm on the other side. And when I was with an asset manager, I remember thinking, we have so many clients. We hear only from 2 or 3, but these 2 or 3 are really influential because they're loud, they are thought-provoking, they're long-term oriented, they are very purpose-led. And inevitably, we're the ones actually influencing the assets of the other clients in a good way. And the other clients were relatively passive. And now I'm trying to be the loud and the provocative and long-term client, going there and try to do exactly the same with our asset managers. And just a very, very practical example, we did, for the first time, we had our stewardship report published. We submitted to the FRC. We wanted to be signatory to the UK stewardship code. And I needed to hear from the asset manager on what they were doing with all our money when they were engaging with companies. And unfortunately, many of them, again, going back to my comment originally, were able to give us a lot of data on, we met 3,000 companies, we talk about ENSNG, we met the CEO and many other interesting statistics. But when we ask, did you set engagement objectives? Did you achieve your engagement objectives? Then the data was much, much poorer, lower, different, depending on what asset managers. And we felt we didn't even have the weapons to go back and challenge because we didn't have the underlying data, which potentially is not just because these managers were not doing it, it's just they weren't tracking it properly. They didn't have the system to be able to report it back. So we just took the effort. We sent very tailored letters to each of them. We identified all the gaps on this data. We sent a letter to the highest level representation, CCing all the people we collaborated with, informing them that the letter was coming. We didn't want to be, in some ways, negative in the approach. It was really to try to trigger some change. And the positive feedback that we got from the people that we actually reached out to, the people we were collaborating with, was great. They were like, finally, I have something to bring in the meeting and say, we need to spend the money to track what we're doing and report back to the clients. They just needed that very formal message to be empowered. As much as other people in the companies tell us, ask this question, ask the questions to the board, because then my job has a meaningful purpose. So yes, I think we have a role to play as provocative, but also thought through and ambitious clients. We might not get exactly to that point, but maybe in the middle of it, and it's already a success.
Super. Caroline, on your side, do you see that is it a pool? Yeah.
Well, we spend a lot of time talking to asset managers, and I have to say I've been obviously, really positively surprised. I just got back from Tokyo. I spent a lot of time in the US talking to asset managers. So I'm telling you, it's not just Europe, or maybe sometimes people think that Europe is so far ahead, which is true to some extent, but that's also the result of regulations. I think, one of the reasons why France has pushed out was because pretty well after 2015, they actually had Article 173, that they actually needed to start to embed this into the asset management culture. And I am always so positively surprised when I then go to the US, where there is the most noise, and you see very large asset managers actually buying very bespoke ESG entities in Europe to help them actually accelerate the ESG integration. Similarly, I was with some of the life companies in Tokyo, and just seeing the thoughtfulness. One of the largest pension funds in Japan is GPIF, and their stewardship code goes back to about 2014 when they initially launched that. So I think the impetus is there, and I would say, recently when I was in New York for Climate Week, they were saying, I met with one of the asset managers, and they were asked point blank in front of a full room, is ESG stopping? And 3 of them started laughing and said, no, this is not going anywhere. The train's left the station, we're going, this is why we do it. And the interesting thing I would say from an asset owner side, and we talked about this probably about 4 years ago, I would say there's this interesting generational play right now, because you've got new, younger asset owners really driving out on this, and they're actually having an influence on their parents, how that money is being invested. And so you've kind of got a multiple generational effect coming through from the asset owners. So I see it very positively, but it's not surprising given the seat I sit in. But what I have found, and Valeria, I'd be really interested in your view on this actually, is that in some instances, the fixed income is actually pushing out further than the equity side is. And so what's happened is that because the equity isn't having the conversation, which is often in the C-suite, CFO, CEO level, there's sort of mixed messages coming through. So the Treasury and the funding teams will tell internally, we are getting ESG or green questions, environmental questions all the time. And the CFO is saying, well, no, actually, we don't hear any of these questions. So I found that quite interesting. So we try now, when we talk to asset managers, say, look, could you please also put these questions into the equity meetings so that we actually generate that flow of information quicker?
I have exactly the opposite experience, but it's interesting. It might depend on organization, but I found that usually the equity floors are more equipped because they've been doing voting for many years. They've been looking at governance for ages, and they were equipped to have this conversation on a regular basis, while the credit investment teams were a little bit more, well, we have our data, we make our own analysis when it's the right time to sell and buy, but they didn't have those interactions with the companies as we felt. And we tried to actually transfer the knowledge of the equity floors to the fixed income floor. And then ultimately, at the time, we were able to have both in the calls, which I think is probably the best option, right? When alignment is possible. I think on the majority of the cases, alignment is possible. When we engage on behalf of all asset classes. So when we talk to the companies, we say how much we are invested in, regardless of being equity or fixed income. So we try to give the message that we are invested in many different ways in your organization, and we think, regardless of the angle, we're looking for you to do X, Y, Z. And that's the expectation we also share with the managers. So it's interesting that you had a different experience. I think it depends potentially on the organizations, yeah.
So we talk about asset owners, asset managers, banks, the company. Who else is missing? And, well, we talked about the potential role of governments and the partnerships. But who else is missing, and how we can align those, what does the asset owner want? What the asset manager wants? What's the banks want? And what the corporate wants? I mean, I speak to CFOs on a regular basis. They want lower cost of capital. They want return to shareholders. So, but how can we, in your experience, align all of those? Don't know if, Ben, you have... Nice to speak to you, Ben, because, of course, you are remote. I mean, not remote, but like you are in a privileged position. You can critique, you can point the fingers. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I think one of the, we were having this conversation just before, is that sometimes there's a big gap between, we know at a kind of global level what we need to achieve on climate and nature, but then there's a big jump between then an individual company, which is then figuring out, well, what's my dependency on nature? What does good look like for me? And there's a huge gap when often they're starting from absolutely zero, no knowledge of how to understand their direct, let alone indirect impacts on nature. There's this huge gap. And then if you're a fund manager sat in the middle looking after an asset class, thinking, well, what do I know about, we're reliant on the companies telling me, and then you've got the blind leading the blind. So there's a real risk in amongst there. Now, fast forward 10 years, we'll probably have much more reliable ways of tracking data and so on. But in the meantime, we need to get there. And that's a challenge for businesses that, of course, are used to have very high levels of very reliable, good data to make typical commercial decisions. So having a much lower threshold of quality of information is a real challenge. But I think there's some interesting, I think one of the gaps actually the evidence base. So there's interesting coalitions now happening between NGOs and academics saying, what are the big issues in climate and nature for particular sectors? So that helps bridge that gap between an individual company and the global level. So, for example, during Climate Week, a consortium with people like Business for Nature, World Economic Forum, launched some nature positive pathways. And so they set out for 13 key sectors. These are your major dependencies on nature. Here's what you need to be working on. So it's so then as an asset manager, that's an incredible piece of equipment in your arsenal, because then you can say to somebody in travel and tourism, okay, so these are the big dependencies on nature. What are you doing about it? That's a threat to your capital value and your asset flows. So what are you doing about it? That's a much more specific question. You don't have to have all the data on it. That's good enough. It's roughly west. If we don't know the exact sort of postcode we're heading for. And so I think that's going to be a really helpful bridging gap in between. And I think that idea of aligning around shared interests, because of course it's then that if you're doing that, you're protecting your financial flows as well as natural flows, and that's in everybody's interest, and it's having a sighting on that, which can, I think, be part of the process of aligning interests along the flow. I guess the other element could be around advisors, I guess, as well as we talked about asset managers, asset owners, but also advisors as well, and some of the sort of the data providers. I guess that's another area to look at, but that's maybe a few little bits of the jigsaw puzzle.
Super. Caroline, how do you, because when we spoke before this, to prepare this panel, you talked about materiality and finance. So is it what motivates the companies you talk to?
I'll just take one step previous from your question really quickly, because I I think actually part of that value chain that's missing a little bit is the auditors. I think there's a lot of consultants and advisors, but actually it'd be really helpful if, because every small...
Is there some auditors?
It would...
Yes.
Because right now, especially for some of the smaller companies, everyone will have, have an auditor in to help. And I think slowly, as we start to look at some of the frameworks coming through from the International Sustainability Standards Board, S1, S2, one is sustainability, the other one is climate, we're starting to actually get templates that we can follow. And so what I think would be really helpful is if the auditors kind of start to build that in a little bit more. And I'm not just talking about the big four, I'm talking more broadly in smaller organizations, so that it kind of comes from the capital flows, but also it comes from the bottom up, and they're sitting around the table as they start to build this into the systems. So that would be sort of, I think, we don't talk about the auditors enough, what important role that they would actually play in this. And the other question is financial materiality. So I guess the financial materiality comes back a little bit because, actually it depends point. When you sometimes start this, it seems like it's quicksand. It's just like you feel like you're stepping in one direction and it just keeps going deeper, and you go into another direction and it goes deeper, and you sort of almost are grasping for air on how to do this, because this is big, this isn't easy. And so I think what's really important is sometimes cutting it back to something that is manageable and measurable, or that is really important to your business, versus trying to kind of boil the ocean here. And Ben, I think, gave a fantastic example of what actually is important for certain businesses. It's not everything. And so giving that, and that's where the heat maps are very helpful, and kind of laying the groundwork. What do I actually focus on? And what is actually going to have the biggest impact, both positive and negative? I think often we talk about the risks more so than the opportunities, because we shouldn't forget that, and Mark Carney repeats this all the time, you should not forget the opportunity piece of this, and how to actually kind of compensate the risk element to actually put it into the fun bit, if you will.
Super. Now, so we talked about asset owners, we talked about asset managers, you mentioned services, service providers. We talked about auditors, which is kind of service provider, but maybe let's carve out an auditor kind of category. And we talked obviously about the corporates quite a bit. So we are here about how do we support them to transform their business. So what would we say collectively? And that's just a start, because then you will talk with each other and you will try to figure it out. What would you say to convince an asset owner, an asset manager, a service provider, an auditor, or a corporate to be purpose-led? So let's start with the asset owner. So, well, you can't answer, or maybe you can.
Preaching to the converted, though.
Yeah, exactly. Caroline?
What would one say?
As an advocate, so what would you say to them to convince them to really embed practices, have a climate-minded policy, and other topics that we discuss? So what would you say? Again, we are trying to bring that ecosystem in line and align them. So what would you say?
So I love this one, which asset owners often tell you is about the fiduciary responsibility.
Okay.
And that the fiduciary responsibility is only to look at returns, and that it's only financial material or financial returns that count. Now, often, particularly in the pension space, those assets go beyond 3 years or 5 years or 20 years. So actually, I would always argue that building in any kind of sustainability assessment is actually their fiduciary responsibility because of the decline of the potential assets in the long run. So that would be my kind of way to land that.
So fiduciary responsibility for the long run, not the 3 to 5. Okay, good. Now, I forgot the banks, actually. Sorry. So we have 6 categories. So now, to the asset manager, that's easy. Easy. That's your bread and butter. So how do you say to an asset manager, you need to look at decarbonization, for example, in your portfolio. You need to have products that help us decarbonize, because we are your client, the asset owner. That's just an example.
Yeah, no, I think the fiduciary duty argument works for the asset manager very well too, because we have fiduciary duty towards the beneficiary of the pension schemes. They have a fiduciary duty towards us as client. And if you frame it in that way, I think it's a winning case, as we probably could not argue against the fact that a lot of these issues are systemic issues that will impact portfolios in the long run. The conversation is a lot about the horizon of investments though, so I think we as asset owners need to make sure that when we actually issue mandates, we assess performance of our managers in the long run rather than on a quarterly basis, because then we will not be consistent with our approach. So that could be the way of aligning incentives, the way also you actually write your IMAs, your investment agreements, and we actually redrafted completely a template to make sure we integrated all our expectation on ENSNG in the contracts themselves. So it doesn't become a nice conversation only, it actually becomes a core element of assessment on how they're performing. And we can actually move assets if they're not performing against these expectations.
That's the stick.
That's
yeah,
the stick.
the famous stick and carrot, for those who remember that. Great. Okay, so the IMA, obviously, and your power as an asset owner is very, I think is compelling. What about now the banks? Who faces the banks? Do you speak to banks?
We do have banks in our investment portfolios, and we do get the question all the time, what do you do with banks? And we haven't actually engaged directly with the banks yet. There's a collaborative engagement initiative engaging with banks. It's coordinated by IIGCC, the Institutional Investor Network on Climate Change here in Europe. And I think also TPI is piloting now a framework for the banking sector. So if you're interested to have some tools to understand if banks are aligned or not with different scenarios, we have something there now. Our managers are very active though. They've been filing resolution with some banks. They've been asking for phasing out coal. And there's been actually quite a lot of these resolutions in the last proxy voting season in the US too, which achieved some level of support, always keeping in the context that actually this support is declining because of the situation in the US. But overarchingly, there was support. So I think it's in the agenda, maybe not directly for us for direct conversations, but definitely in the agendas of our asset managers.
Great. But Caroline then, so if you had to speak to a bank executives and say, I mean, I'm quite climate oriented, so I'm a bit biased there, but stop lending to expansionary fossil fuel producers, for example. What would be how can you convince them? What would be the argument? How are you going to?
So, I've probably slightly gone further, maybe I don't know which way direction I would call this, I think actually the stopping versus the transition, I think is actually getting complicated. I am kind of coming much more into the camp of the transition. And I have to say it is important, also from a social perspective. We cannot have the unforeseen social consequences of sometimes pulling out of certain communities and coming back to your point too quickly. We do have to transition. And I made reference to it being in Asia last week. That becomes very apparent because we also have that responsibility as we start to look into the emerging markets. And 40% in Asia is still coal-fired power. So this isn't something that we can switch off right away. We do need to support them and get the new industries in, but they're going to need time as well. So we have to become quite realistic. So I would say, I think now the conversations I have with CEOs or chairs at financial institutions or CFOs is a lot more measured about how do we actually all collectively move in the same direction and understand what we need to do, and then set ourselves very clear targets over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to actually achieve that, versus trying to be very black and white.
That's the transition plan, and I mean the pathway is not interesting. What about the corporates? That's easy. Well, easy. I mean, well, Ben, what's the compelling argument if you try to sway an executive?
Well, I think for corporates, it's the same as with banks, actually. It goes back to what I was saying, which is that it's a false dilemma, I think, because the idea that you can simply maximize profits, that doesn't depend on social and environmental collapse, then, I don't know what, world they're living in, really. So it's a false dilemma because it assumes that we have infinite growth, financial capital sits in the world on its own. As I say, it's a false dilemma, I think, in the beginning. So I think it's about pointing out the dependencies on nature and society. I think it's pointing out how where a business is relying on externalizing its costs, which, let's be honest, most businesses have been trying to do that for a long time, that's actually creating liabilities in all sorts of ways, regulatory, reputational, if you want to attract talent and so on, that's a big problem for you. So there's all these kinds of financial and direct and indirect, so there's no actual real pure externalities. They're actually quite hard to find because they do come back to bite you sooner or later. It's in the nature and the timing of it.
Super.
So I think the other thing is that, so Alex Edmonds, Professor Alex Edmonds, has got a great term. He talks about, often we focus on the error of what he calls commission. We did something we shouldn't have done it, which is often what we talk about. We've invested in stranded assets. We shouldn't have invested in stranded assets. So that's one obvious. But he also talks about the error of omission. We didn't do something. We should have done it. We didn't do it. So, and I think that's the other critical element, is that sort of opportunity cost. And again, to your point, fiduciary duty is actually, contrary to popular belief, board members are not responsible for their shareholders. They're responsible to the long-term interests of the company, who are owned by who the shareholders own shares in. It's not the same thing. So it's the long-term interests of the company, not their quarterly returns. And so I think, in that respect, it's about what are the value propositions that are going to be relevant, resilient for the longevity of this company. And I think externalizing costs and being invested in old business models is not the answer to that question. So a lot of it is much around the error of omission as well as commission.
Super. Look, do you want to say something? No? Okay. We want to continue this conversation. We're not going to solve it just now, but we talked about the fiduciary duty for the, responsibility for the asset owner. We talk about, for the asset manager, the IMA and the stick, yeah? For the banks, not sure if you really answered. You talked a lot about transition, not black and white, and the transition, the needs of transition to be implemented. On the corporate side, we talked about, it's not just about the profits, about the long term, the importance of the dependencies, opportunity costs, and long-term interest. I want to leave some time for questions, though, in the audience. Do you have any question to the panel? Perhaps we can take 3. There's one over there. Well, there's several. So, okay, so that would be. I've been told it could be challenging, but okay, please go ahead. Let's take 3 quick questions and then we'll answer. Yeah.
Thank you for giving us an insight into your world. I don't come from this world. But thank you for giving us an insight into this world, because I don't come from this world. But I have covered these stories for a very long time. And I've also covered innovative financing in lots of different countries. And the one thing that strikes me from everything you haven't said is there's no time frame. And we haven't got much time. So I would really welcome appreciating how difficult it is to move your industry.
So what's the question? Sorry.
How long is it going to take you to create this system change?
Okay, thank you. Another question. Yeah? Go ahead. Perhaps give your name.
Hi, my name is Carolina.
Ciao, Carolina.
Yeah, ciao. I heard you talk a lot about different agents, but we didn't talk about the role of insurance and how they play a part in also being agents of change in all of these, and what they can, not only through the regulation and what they choose to insure, but also their research and the data that they can offer. So
Super.
I'd like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so the role of insurance. There, yeah. So you can see that, when you come to a room like that, when you are in the front rows, you have a strategic advantage when you ask questions. Good.
Hi, thanks. My name is Mark Drull from a startup company called New Foundation Farms. Okay. And my question is to the panel is if you were thinking 100 years from now, and you're absolutely certain, as most of us would be, that our companies don't exist at that stage. And so the way you answer the questions now is based on what would you do if you didn't have to care about your current organization's success? What would you say and do differently that you can't do at the moment because you have to think first and foremost about the success of the current dominant players in the status quo?
Super, thank you. So we'll stop there with the questions. So 3 questions, the one on the time frame, role of insurance. Sorry, I didn't mention, we didn't talk about insurance, it's true. I mean, well, you will answer this one. And it's the role of the panel, right? I mean, I'm moderator, I have that privilege. And what would you do differently if you didn't have the short-term pressure? Please.
Maybe on the time frame, and maybe we should have convened that. We do have a time frame. We have targets. We have decarbonization targets of our portfolio up to 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we have different levers that we are using to hopefully achieve those targets. We can move the money a little bit. We can change benchmarks of reference. We can exclude some companies. But definitely one big lever is stewardship, because to the point you were saying, it's not just about getting rid of the problem, is staying in and trying to influence from within, which is probably the most difficult one. So we translate the same time frame to the companies too. We want to see targets in the mid, short, and long term. We're not just happy to see we're going to be net zero in 2050. We actually want to see the roadmap. So absolutely important to have the time frame.
Super. What about the insurance? Who can take this one? I mean, any?
I can do that. I think insurance actually does play a significant role. I think at this point there is a question, and I'm probably going to speak out of order here, but anyway, around the current models that are being used with regard to climate change, and how the forward-looking actually is now looking at backward-looking, which is actually not correct. And so there is definitely a movement in the insurance industry to actually sort of align and start to think about how to reconsider the models and the pricing. Now, to be fair, all the contracts are usually only 1 year. So I think the immediate urgency is not there in the same way, potentially, that it has been on the balance sheets. But that doesn't mean that the regulators are not asking all these questions of the insurance companies. There is also, I would say, a considered approach in the industry bodies to think about the uninsurable and how to deal with that, particularly from a socioeconomic context, and how to actually bridge these gaps. So I wouldn't say that it's not happening. It is definitely happening. It's just not all the answers are there and evident right now.
Super. Third question. You did answer a bit of that. Now that the question about the corporate, you talked about the trade-off, the long term.
Yeah.
Do you want to add a bit more?
Yeah, and I think if I can touch on actually the others, if I may, only in because you're absolutely right about the urgency. We're in the decisive decade. We've only got 6 years and counting. So we don't have time. And the reality is, we've sat on this, obfuscated, denied, this for decades. So we've only got ourselves to blame for the mess we're in, right? We're hitting the brakes incredibly late in the journey. So I've limited sympathy for the situation we find ourselves in. So I think you're right, there is real urgency. We can't lose sight of that. As David Attenborough said, decisions we'll take in the next few years will have consequences for the next thousands of years, because we start to hit tipping points. And I think that has a real implication, because it means that what we tend to think about the future is it'll be much like the past. We tend to think in quite a linear way. The future is not going to be like that. None of the stats tell us anything that we're facing into tipping points, disruption. If we think we've been disrupted by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and what's happening in Israel, we ain't seen nothing yet. So I think how we factor that into our business models, our instruments, we don't have the instruments to do that, let's be quite honest. So the longer we leave it, the more expensive it will get, the more disruptive it will get, and the worse the payback. We know that from economics. The Stern report told us that a long time ago on climate. The Dasgupta report told us that on nature. It's very clear. And I think we're not walking into the future that's very real. Which kind of brings me back to, and just on that point, I think it was the CEO of AXA said, in the 4-degree world, the world is uninsurable because it just throws all of you just can't put in you don't have the stability with which to price in, risk and returns. So that basically undermines the whole of the banking system, the economy as we know it. And that's more or less, remember, the track we're on. We're not far off that with the current policies in place. Let's have a degree of realism. So I think when it comes to the future, it's a great question because I think we are so bound up in this sort of short-term financial returns. I think it does restrict quite profoundly our ability to think about how we can create value in the future, really profoundly, which is why I think startups are so interesting. And it's lovely, the startups we work with at CISL, because they come in with such fresh ideas. They don't have that incumbency restrictions. They can have a sense of what that value propositions are. And I think that does open up. And what I would like to see, I think, is a real diversity, actually, of businesses with a diversity of purposes. Because at the moment, I don't think we have that. We have an oligopoly where they all look much like the same, all providing similar products, similar services, and it's the illusion of choice. So, and I think what I'd like to see is a much greater plurality of businesses facing plural purposes that are really serving society in fresh new ways and in creative new ways. But let's be honest, they're going to be facing to a very disruptive future in which they deliver that. But I also suspect that how they create and share that value will look very different to how it does today.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that you asked the question, especially, the question on timing is super, super important. So you are all agents of change. I've tried to get some tools for you, some arguments, or to talk to each other. So can I ask, who works as an asset owner here? Is there any asset owner? Apart from Valeria, of course. This is the only one. Okay, she's the one with the power, remember. Who works with asset management, within asset management? Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, okay. Who works within insurance? Okay, we have seen there. Who works in a bank? Great. Yeah. Who works as a consultant? Okay. Okay, so good. And what about corporates? We have some corporates, Great. So guys, so we have the ecosystem, yeah? So it's up to you now. That's the third part of the evening. Make it happen. Thank you very much.